Hello everybody. It is September 27th, 2025 here in the United States of America. And in this video I'm going to move away from talking about American domestic politics and I'm going to talk about geopolitics, specifically involving the EU. And what I think about the EU's goal of attempting to become some kind of superpower independent of the United States and able to stand up to other great world powers like Russia, China, and India. Europe wants to stay relevant, and they feel the only way to do so is with the entirety of the EU and all of its military and economic potential. But I do believe this current iteration of the EU, with being led the way that it is doomed to failure, mainly because the EU is being led by bureaucrats, people that despise nationalism of any kind. They want some kind of post-national superstate, but aren't managing that in a way where it could remain stable and united, and that people with nationalistic tendencies would actually desire to be part of it. The European Union is always going to be at war against itself and in perpetual conflict with some of its stronger and more assertive member states. So Europe, Western Europe specifically, has been relegated to basically being a vassal of the United States. They are dominated by, I would say, U.S. policy. They really have no independent policy of their own, and they're essentially completely reliant on U.S. Funding for NATO. They have historically chipped in very little, and the United States has funded the lion's share of it. European powers have allowed their militaries to dwindle to, well, in the case of Great Britain, it's said that the entirety of its armed forces, all of the branches, could fit inside of a soccer stadium. And then if it actually were to enter a high-intensity conflict, that it would be unable to continue fighting within several weeks, and that's with its active duty military. France, in a similar boat, while they have one of the better militaries in Europe, if they were in any kind of high intensity conflict, well, they don't have enough armored vehicles and soldiers to last more than a few weeks. They don't have thousands of tanks on hand, they have hundreds, and they have the Leclerc, which there's only a few hundred of those made. Germany is in a very similar boat. Germany has been completely neutered ever since the end of World War II. That has been a policy of the United States to keep Germany from becoming nationalistic again because of its location in Europe and its tendency to want to completely dominate European politics. Ever since the Ukraine war broke out, there's this drive within the EU to militarize the EU, to make the member states strong again militarily and can assert some kind of military pressure against Russia. Funny enough, the best military in Europe, despite what people say, and just before I continue, this is something that kind of drives me crazy. And when people speak of Ukraine fighting Russia, they say, oh, well, big Russia can't even beat little, tiny, insignificant Ukraine. Actually, first of all, Ukraine is the largest country in Europe outside of Russia. It's a very large country. It's the size of Texas. And they also had the largest military at the time, one of the better funded militaries at the time. And after the war with Russia began, it was almost completely subsidized by NATO and received pretty damn near unlimited funding, ammunition, and weapon systems. Hundreds and hundreds of armored vehicles, trucks, drones, fighter jets, what have you. So Ukraine is not a weak country by any means. It actually wasn't a weak country prior to 2022, a corrupt country with serious internal problems, but because of its martial culture and attitudes that it has, plus having a large military with a fairly large amount of Soviet material left over, quite a bit of ammunition and tanks, and a large manpower pool to draw from, Ukraine had a very powerful military. So Russia having to resort to a war of attrition to wear down Ukraine's military over many years so that it can reduce its own casualties makes a lot of sense. And what I think Western Europe is essentially doing is essentially fighting Russia. What's the term for this? vicariously through Ukraine. They need Ukraine to fight Russia because Ukraine is the only country in Europe that's actually able to do it, not defeat Russia, but draw Russia into a costly conflict. They're the only ones that are able to do it, frankly. No other country, especially Western Europe, is fit for any kind of large-scale combat. The governments in Western Europe are also very unpopular. It's kind of funny watching Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron become very hyper militaristic and nationalistic overnight, and then expect this large contingent of their own citizens that they've abused and neglected and shunned for years. I don't know if they expected them to respond with patriotic fervor and call for war with Russia and be on their side. Why would they be? It's kind of funny. Like Keir Starmer did this goofy advertisement where he wore like an untucked military shirt, I guess to look tough, while standing in a field with some other military guys trying to ramp up his country for a potential conflict with Russia, a conflict they're absolutely not prepared to fight for. And frankly, Western Europeans can't hate their leaders so much that they're just not willing to fight for them if they're called up. Their countries have so many internal problems that they think a war is, especially with Russia, one of the world's great powers, is something that they're just not interested in at all. It would be disastrous. Europe has been systematically deindustrialized. For a long time, they were completely reliant on cheap Russian energy to maintain their economies. And once they became fully invested in this war against Ukraine, and one of the reasons why the Europeans are so hostile against Russia, despite, aside from some of the historical reasons, and it's when it comes to Europe, there's a lot of bad blood between different European countries that goes back hundreds and hundreds of years. One of the reasons why Europe, especially Western Europe, is so leery of Russia is because, once the Cold War ended, I think for a while they assumed that, the Russian Federation would perpetually be a weak neighbor on their borders that they wouldn't really have to pay much mind to. But then once Putin came to power and began to rebuild the Russian Federation, and then once it actually became a world power with a strong economy, I think at that point, they realized rather quickly, if they would be dominated by yet another great power. They're dominated on one hand by the United States, and then the other half of Europe, Eastern Europe, would be dominated by Russia, and they would be stuck in between. And because EU bureaucrats want this post-national superstate, this great superpower that can assert its own influence around the world, they have to eliminate one of those rivals or relegate one of those rivals again to a weakened state. And since it's impossible to do that with the United States for them, they have to choose Russia. This is what it comes down to. They cannot afford to have a powerful resurgent Russia right on their border, even if that resurgent Russia has got to the point where they will sign some kind of treaty saying that they would offer no further westward aggression. This is the fact that they exist on their border and can exert political and economic influence on Europe is something that I think a lot of these bureaucrats can't stand for, because it threatens the EU project as a whole. And one of the dumbest decisions they made prior to this conflict, if they were going to get involved in something like this in the future, was be this dependent on Russian natural gas and oil. They have no other source for it, for cheap energy. It had to be Russia. And if you're going to get invested in a war with your only supply of natural resources, it's not great long-term strategic thinking without any other alternative. I mean, the United States is perfectly willing to sell energy to Europe at a much, 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 much higher cost, because the United States government really doesn't care about the EU project. It still views Europe as a series of vassal states that are under the political domination of the United States, and unfortunately, it's the way it is. Now, funny enough, I think Donald Trump wanted to roll that back a little bit and leave Europe to its own devices, and you think these bureaucrats would be all for it and in favor of it, but they know they're not ready for that yet. Even though that might be what they want in the future, They know they can't stand on their own. The EU is a fractured project. The United Kingdom left it. I think what year was that? Was it 2016, 2017? I forget offhand. But Brexit happened. There's constant pushback from the Poles, the Hungarians especially. The Hungarians they're not stupid enough to cut off their nose to spite their face. They know they need Russian energy and they want to remain a sovereign, independent country within the EU. And that was the original promise of the EU. It would be a joint economic zone, a free travel zone, but now it's got to the point where Brussels wants to politically dominate the EU and make it into something akin to the United States of Europe, I think, is the eventual goal. But the problem with that is each one of these countries are very culturally different and assert their own identity. Europe has fought each other for hundreds and hundreds of years. Like, this idea of united Europe is not like a realistic thing that people actually desire, except for maybe neoliberals that want some kind of like Star Trek federation for Europe, and they think the EU is going to function as something like that. The average, I'd say, conservative European looks at the EU as some kind of oppressive bureaucracy they want no part of. They want their countries to be strong, sovereign, independent nations. And funny enough, the EU bureaucrats, if they were smart, they could have harnessed that years ago. They absolutely could have. They could have made the EU some kind of nationalistic European project that harnessed that desire for like a strong and independent Europe that was proud of its history and proud of its ancestry and proud of its accomplishments, and actually nurtured that into some kind of like federation of states that they could have found a healthy balance between, okay, so we're all going to work together for everyone's own mutual interests, but allow states to have enough sovereignty where they don't feel resentment towards the greater project as a whole. And like, the European bureaucrats couldn't think far enough ahead to actually implement policies like that. These are post-national idealists that don't believe in the nation state. They think it's a defunct idea. They believe in post-national state like super projects like this, and they don't really understand that it's not like a realistic, feasible thing to implement on people. There has to be some kind of commonality, ancestry, common cause between the people within a project like this to get it to actually function. And then you can't also abuse the member states within it, especially member states that have a lot of influence and power over the project and fund a great deal of it. So this desire by EU bureaucrats to make the EU into some kind of superpower that can stand on its own, especially one that is so poor in resources. Like, Europe has to import its energy. It can't supply it itself. It has to import its oil. It has to import its natural gas. Europe has always been very resource poor. Right? This was one of the reasons why Hitler invaded East. It was to get the oil to keep his Reich alive. He knew he needed it. And that's always been one of the impetuses for European expansion and colonization is resources. They need it. Like, Europe is not, Western Europe and Central Europe are not resource-rich regions for energy, especially modern energy. And if they don't want to go nuclear because of their, again, this is another problem with the EU having this such a strong, I don't want to say green party, but there's a lot of environmentalists in Europe that refuse to utilize nuclear power, especially in Germany. Now, France doesn't really have that issue. Germany refuses to nuclearize, and it's facing serious problems now that it doesn't have Russian natural gas to rely on. So, really not sure how Europe, the bureaucrats at the EU, the bureaucrats within the EU and Brussels expect this project to continue on in the future. I think they stumbled into this war with Russia, tried to use Ukraine as a battering ram against Russia. There's all this bad blood they have towards Russia, but at the same time, they made themselves completely reliant on Russian energy, and they didn't really have a long-term plan. They just assumed that, I guess, the Russian government would collapse quickly, and then they could just resume energy supplies from whatever government succeeded Putin's. I don't know. Clearly, that didn't work. they're dumping everything they can into Ukraine to use Ukraine as a battering ram against Russia, because they know, to assert their own sovereignty, they have to at least focus on one of the dominant powers that could have influence over Europe, and that's Russia, because Russia's the weaker out of the United States and Russia, and Russia doesn't have the same amount of influence in Europe that the United States does. So you got to pick one or the other. So they're going to go with Russia, especially since Russia shares a land border with Europe. This is why there's such an impetus within Europe to try to break Russia up into like these little tiny ethnic enclaves and states, which is really funny because a lot of these bureaucrats will openly talk about this and then wonder why Russia is now so hostile to them, considering that this is their goal, I guess. But I think the EU project is doomed to failure. I think it's run by incompetent, frankly stupid and short-sighted people. If it was run by pragmatists and political realists and people that harnessed that appreciation for the Roman Empire, that really can harness like independent, national identity and this desire and to preserve history and to preserve their own like national identities. If they actually learned how to harvest that, they could have made the EU a very, very, very potent thing, But unfortunately for them, didn't happen like that, And again, like them also taking in massive amounts of immigrants, migrants from wars that they participated in. The destruction of Syria and Iraq and Libya really contributed to this. And again, like the EU went along with these wars, and it's another reason why they shot themselves in the foot. It's just when bureaucrats and intellectuals and people with really no experience in running and managing a civilization are handed the keys to a civilization, well, they tend to screw things up pretty badly. And I think all in all, that's essentially what happened with Europe. And then also Europe was allowed to become lazy and stagnate because they were completely dependent on military protection of the United States and cheap Russian energy. And I think they're trying to stand back on their feet, but the people that are running the show don't know how to do that, and I don't think are capable of getting Europe to do that. But anyways, that's all I wanted to talk about in this video. I will be back Tuesday. Should be back Tuesday, depending on how many hours I work, either Tuesday or Wednesday, but I'm going to shoot for Tuesday with another video. And until then, everybody take care and God bless.